At 11 years old, she'd never given much thought to how quickly life could change. But as she doubled over with another wave of nausea, that morning in suburban Minnesota would mark the beginning of something unprecedented. "Mom!" Sarah's voice quavered as she called out, her small hand pressed against the cool bathroom tiles. The sound of hurried footsteps preceded Jennifer Thompson's appearance at the doorway, her honey blonde hair still damp from her morning shower. "Baby, what's wrong?" Jennifer knelt beside her daughter, pressing a cool hand to Sarah's forehead. The contrast between her mother's touch and her own clammy skin made Sarah shiver. "I don't feel right," Sarah whispered, her green eyes welling with tears. "Everything's spinning, and my stomach feels weird. Not like when I had the flu last winter, different." Jennifer's face creased with worry as she helped Sarah to her feet. The kitchen clock read 7:15 a.m., its steady ticking a counterpoint to Sarah's irregular breathing. Outside, the Minnesota spring was in full bloom, magnolia trees dotting their suburban street with pink and white blossoms, but neither mother nor daughter noticed the beauty that morning. Dr. Emily Chen's office was usually a place of comfort for Sarah. The pediatrician had treated her since she was a toddler, and the waiting room walls were covered with cheerful murals of woodland creatures. But today, something felt different. The stuffed giraffe she'd always loved to pet seemed to stare at her accusingly, and the usual calming lavender scent made her stomach churn. "The blood work should tell us what's going on," Dr. Chen said, her voice carefully neutral as she made notes on her tablet. "But I'd like to do an ultrasound as well, just to be thorough." Jennifer gripped Sarah's hand tighter, and Sarah could feel her mother's pulse racing through their connected palms. The examination room seemed to shrink, the mint green walls closing in as Dr. Chun prepared the ultrasound machine. The gel was cold on Sarah's stomach, and she flinched. Dr. Chen's expression changed as she moved the wand, her professional composure cracking for just a moment. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by the quiet whoosh of the ultrasound machine. "Jennifer," Dr. Chen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." Sarah watched her mother follow Dr. Chun into the hallway, their shadows visible through the frosted glass of the examination room door. She couldn't make out their words, but she could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like a sob. When they returned, Jennifer's face was ashen, and Dr. Chen's eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Sarah," the doctor began, sitting on her rolling stool and wheeling closer to the examination table, "I need to tell you something very important, and it might be scary to hear." The words that followed seemed to come from far away, as if Sarah was underwater. "Pregnant. Multiple fetuses. Unprecedented. High risk." Each term felt like a stone dropping into the pond of her consciousness, sending ripples of confusion and fear through her young mind. The drive home was silent, the familiar streets of their Minneapolis suburb suddenly alien and threatening. Jennifer gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, and Sarah could see tears trailing down her mother's cheeks. At home, the house felt different too. Sarah's father, David, was still at work at the construction company he managed, unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. Her teenage brother, Jack, was at basketball practice, probably joking with his friends, not knowing that his sister's life, all their lives, had just changed forever. Jennifer moved through the house like a ghost, picking up Sarah's scattered textbooks and straightening picture frames with mechanical precision. Sarah watched from the couch, her hands resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach, trying to comprehend that within her small body, something impossible was growing. The afternoon light was fading when David's truck pulled into the driveway. Sarah heard her mother meet him at the door, heard the low murmur of their voices, followed by her father's sharp exclamation. Their footsteps approached the living room, and Sarah looked up to see her father's face, usually so strong and certain, now confused and afraid. "Princess," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he sat beside her on the couch. "Your mom told me what the doctor said. I want you to know that we're here for you, no matter what happens." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Outside, a neighbor's wind chimes tinkled in the evening breeze, and somewhere down the street, Children were playing. Normal sounds from a normal world that suddenly seemed very far away. That night, as Sarah lay in her bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling, she could hear her parents talking in low, urgent voices downstairs. The words drifted up through the heating vent. Options, specialists, support, media. Each word carried the weight of decisions too heavy for an 11-year-old to bear. The moon cast silver light through her window, creating patterns on her quilted bedspread, the one her grandmother had made for her last Christmas. Sarah traced the stitched patterns with her finger, wondering if her grandmother would still love her when she found out. Would anyone? Her phone buzzed with texts from her best friend, Madison, asking why she'd missed school today. Sarah stared at the screen until it went dark, unable to find words to explain something she couldn't understand herself. In the bathroom down the hall, she could hear her mother crying softly, trying to muffle the sound. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible, wishing she could disappear into the soft folds of her blankets and wake up to find this had all been a strange dream. But as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring more tests, more questions, and more impossible revelations. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was a shooting star streaking across the Minnesota sky, and she made a wish, not for herself, but for strength for her family in the days to come. The shooting star's trail had barely faded from Sarah's vision when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Madison. It was Dr. Chin's office confirming an early morning appointment at Minneapolis General Hospital. Sarah watched the screen's blue light illuminate her ceiling, creating shadows that seemed to dance and multiply, just like the impossible news growing inside her. Morning came too quickly, the weak spring sunshine struggling through a blanket of clouds that had settled over the city overnight. Jennifer helped Sarah dress in her favorite comfort clothes, soft gray leggings, and an oversized University of Minnesota sweatshirt that had once belonged to Jack. The familiar scent of fabric softener couldn't mask the antiseptic smell that seemed to cling to Sarah's skin from yesterday's doctor's visit. The hospital loomed before them, its glass and steel facade reflecting the cloudy sky. Sarah's father had taken the day off work, an unprecedented occurrence that underscored the gravity of the situation. As they walked through the automatic doors, Sarah felt like she was entering another world, one where children her age faced adult realities they couldn't possibly understand. Dr. Chin was waiting for them in the maternal-fetal medicine department, alongside Dr. Marcus Whitman, a specialist whose grave expression made Sarah's stomach tighten. The ultrasound room was darker and larger than the one at Dr. Chin's office, filled with machines that hummed and blinked like alien technology. "Sarah," Dr. Whitman began, his voice gentle but serious, "we're going to do a very detailed scan today. It might take a while, but it's important that we understand exactly what we're dealing with." The gel was warmer this time, but Sarah still shivered as Dr. Whitman began the examination. The screen showed mysterious shapes that the doctors studied intently, their whispered conversations creating a soundtrack of tension. Jennifer gripped David's hand so tightly that their fingers were white, while Sarah focused on counting the ceiling tiles to keep her mind off the pressure of the ultrasound wand. After what seemed like hours, Dr. Whitman sat back, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. "I've never seen anything quite like this in my 30 years of practice," he said, his voice a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed amazement. "Sarah is carrying 11 distinct fetuses." The word 11 seemed to echo in the small room, bouncing off the walls and multiplying like the lives inside her. Sarah heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, felt her father's hand begin to tremble where it rested on her shoulder. The ceiling tiles she'd been counting began to blur as tears filled her eyes. Dr. Whitman continued speaking, his words washing over Sarah like waves. High-risk pregnancy, careful monitoring, unprecedented case, medical marvel. Each term added another layer of unreality to the situation. She wasn't just pregnant, she was carrying enough babies to fill a small classroom. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of blood draws, measurements, and consultations with specialists whose names and titles blended together. A genetic counselor with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair explained possibilities and probabilities. A high-risk obstetrics nurse demonstrated how to use a fetal heart monitor at home. A nutritionist detailed the massive amount of calories Sarah would need to consume to support 11 growing lives. By early afternoon, Sarah's head was spinning with information, and her body ached from lying still for so many examinations. The hospital cafeteria where they stopped for a late lunch was nearly empty, the sound of their plastic forks scraping against paper plates echoing in the vast space. Sarah pushed her food around, watching the steam rise from her untouched soup while her parents discussed practical matters in low voices. "We'll need to convert the home office," Jennifer was saying, her planning mode activated as a defense against overwhelming emotion. "And the guest room, maybe even part of the basement." "Insurance," David muttered, scrolling through his phone. "We need to talk to HR about coverage. And I should call Mom and Dad before they hear it from someone else." Sarah's phone buzzed again, Madison still trying to reach her. The thought of explaining this to her best friend made her stomach clench. How do you tell someone that your whole life has changed overnight? That your body, still growing itself, was now responsible for 11 other lives? The afternoon brought more tests and a parade of medical students, each wanting to witness this medical anomaly firsthand. Sarah felt like an exhibit in a museum, something to be studied and documented. Dr. Chun, noticing her distress, finally put a stop to it, insisting that Sarah needed rest. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Whitman handed Jennifer a thick folder of information and a schedule of appointments that would bring them back to the hospital 3 times a week. "We're in uncharted territory here," he explained, his face serious. "The risks are significant, to Sarah and to the babies. We need to monitor everything very carefully." The drive home was interrupted by a stop at the pharmacy, where Jennifer filled prescriptions for prenatal vitamins and anti-nausea medication. The pharmacist's eyes widened as she read the prescriptions, and Sarah could feel her curious stare following them through the store. At home, the house felt different, as if it too was struggling to accommodate the news of 11 new lives that would soon require space and care. Sarah's bedroom, with its purple walls and stuffed animals, suddenly seemed childish and inadequate. How could she be someone's mother, let alone 11 someone's mother, when she still slept with her childhood teddy bear? Jack was home when they arrived, having been called by their parents during the day. His usual teenage bravado was replaced by an uncharacteristic gentleness as he helped Sarah up the stairs. "Don't worry, Squirt," he whispered, using his old nickname for her. "I've got your back." That evening, the Thompson family gathered in the living room, the TV silent for the first time in memory. The weight of their new reality settled around them like a heavy blanket. Jennifer had already started making lists, supplies they'd need, modifications to the house, medical expenses to plan for. David sat in his armchair, phone in hand, researching support groups and medical literature. Sarah curled up on the couch, one hand resting on her stomach, trying to imagine 11 tiny lives growing inside her. The magnitude of it was impossible to grasp. Outside, the spring day was ending, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. A missed call from Madison lit up her phone screen again, and Sarah knew she couldn't avoid the outside world forever. As night fell, the family's phones began to ring more frequently. Word was spreading through their small community, the impossible story of an 11-year-old carrying 11 babies. Sarah could hear her mother in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones to her sister in California. Her father was in his study, the murmur of his voice as he talked to her grandparents carrying up through the floor. Sarah lay in bed that night, her mind racing with questions she was afraid to ask. Would she survive this? Would the babies? How would she finish 6th grade? What would people say? The moon cast different shadows now, and the glow-in-the-dark stars seemed to pulse with new meaning. Each one could represent a life she now carried, with one star left over to represent her own uncertain future. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of multiplication. 11 cribs, 11 bottles, 11 first steps, 11 first words. In the darkness, Sarah whispered a countdown, trying to wrap her mind around the number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 heartbeats besides her own. 11 futures intertwined with hers. 11 reasons her world would never be the same. The night stretched on, and Sarah could hear her parents still moving around downstairs, their footsteps heavy with worry and purpose. Tomorrow would bring more appointments, more questions, more decisions. But for now, in the quiet of her room, Sarah listened to the wind in the trees outside her window and imagined she could feel 11 tiny flutters of life, each one a star in its own constellation, each one a miracle and a challenge, each one a reason to be stronger than she ever thought possible. From somewhere down the street, a train whistle sounded, long and low, like a question seeking an answer. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, carrying her thoughts toward an uncertain tomorrow. The world felt both larger and smaller than it had yesterday, as if the universe had compressed itself into her small body while simultaneously expanding to accommodate the magnitude of what was happening within her. The last thing she remembered before drifting off were the sound of her mother's muffled sobs from the master bedroom, the distant rumble of the late-night train, and the feeling that her life had split into two distinct parts, everything before today and everything that would come after. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's hand remained protectively over her stomach, where 11 impossible futures were already beginning to unfold. As dawn broke over Minneapolis, Sarah awoke to find her world had not reversed itself. Overnight. The weight of 11 futures still pressed against her consciousness, as real as the morning light filtering through her curtains. Her dreams had been filled with multiplying cradles and endless crying babies, each one wearing her face like a tiny mirror. The first signs of her body's rebellion came with the sunrise. What had started as mild discomfort yesterday now manifested as waves of nausea that sent her rushing to the bathroom. Jennifer was already awake, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd barely slept. She held Sarah's hair back, murmuring soft words of comfort that seemed to float in the steam from the shower someone had recently used. "Your father's called the school," Jennifer said, helping Sarah back to her room. "We've arranged for home tutoring, at least for now." Dr. Whitman was very clear about minimizing stress and physical activity. The mention of school sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Sarah's chest. Madison had finally stopped texting, but there were dozens of unread messages from other classmates. News traveled fast in middle school, and Sarah could only imagine the whispers that would fill the hallways today. By mid-morning, the house had transformed into something resembling a medical ward. A hospital bed arrived, delivered by men who tried not to stare at the small girl for whom it was intended. Medical monitors appeared, their steady beeping creating a new household rhythm. Jennifer arranged everything in Sarah's room, pushing aside stuffed animals and science fair trophies to make space for equipment that seemed alien in the purple-walled sanctuary of childhood. Dr. Whitman had explained the risks in clinical terms: preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, hemorrhage. But it was the physical reality that hit Sarah hardest. Her body, still growing itself, struggled to accommodate its impossible task. Simple activities like walking to the bathroom became marathons. The stairs might as well have been Mount Everest. The pain started gradually, a dull ache in her lower back that grew until it felt like her spine was being slowly compressed. Jennifer helped her into the new hospital bed, adjusting pillows with the precision of someone trying to control an uncontrollable situation. The bed's mechanical whir as it adjusted seemed too loud in the quiet house, a reminder that their home was no longer just a home. Jack appeared in the doorway during his lunch break from school, his varsity jacket hanging loose on his shoulders. "The guys on the team asked about you," he said, trying to sound casual as he sat on the edge of her bed. "I told them to mind their own business." His attempt at a smile couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. Sarah reached for his hand, noticing how small hers looked in comparison. "Did Madison say anything?" "She stood up for you in homeroom," Jack replied, squeezing her fingers. "When Katie Stevens tried to start some gossip, Madison shut her down. Said anybody who had something to say about you would have to deal with her first." The thought of her best friend defending her honor brought the first real smile to Sarah's face in days. It faded quickly as another wave of pain rolled through her body, this one sharp enough to make her gasp. Jack's face paled, and he called for their mother with a crack in his voice that made him sound young again. The afternoon brought the first of what would become regular visits from Dr. Chin. The pediatrician's familiar presence was comforting, but her furrowed brow, as she checked Sarah's vital signs, betrayed her concern. "Your blood pressure is higher than I'd like," she said, making notes on her tablet. "And these pain levels aren't what we want to see this early." Jennifer stood by the window, arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if holding herself together. "Should we take her back to the hospital?" Dr. Chin shook her head slowly. "Not yet, but she needs complete bed rest. No exceptions. Her body is under a stress, and we need to minimize any additional strain." The words bed rest fell like prison bars around Sarah's world. She watched through her window as neighborhood kids rode their bikes past the house, their shouts and laughter a reminder of the childhood she was leaving behind. A blue jay landed on the maple tree outside, building a nest for its own babies, and Sarah felt a strange kinship with the bird, both of them preparing for motherhood, though the jay surely had an easier task with its few eggs compared to her 11 miracles. David came home early from work, his construction company clothes replaced by the casual where he usually saved for weekends. He carried a stack of paperwork, insurance forms, medical documentation, financial papers that needed attention. Sarah could hear her parents up late into the night, voices tense as they discussed money, logistics, and futures they'd never planned for. The community began to respond as news spread. Casseroles appeared on their doorstep. Cards filled their mailbox. Their church pastor visited, offering prayers and support that felt simultaneously comforting and insufficient. Sarah's grandmother arrived from Florida, moving into the guest room with a determination to help that manifested in constant cleaning and cooking. But it was the isolation that hit hardest. Sarah's world contracted to the dimensions of her bedroom, the medical equipment her only companions during the long hours when everyone else was busy. She tried to focus on her studies. The tutor came 3 times a week, bringing assignments and attempting normalcy, but concentration was difficult when every movement brought discomfort and every hour brought new worries. The babies made their presence known more each day. Dr. Whitman had shown them on ultrasound how they were positioned, 11 tiny lives arranged like a complex puzzle inside her. Sometimes, lying awake at night, Sarah imagined she could feel each one, could distinguish their individual movements. She began giving them names in her head, not real names but characteristics: the wiggler, the sleeper, the kicker, the dancer. Jennifer quit her job at the real estate office, unable to balance work with Sarah's constant care needs. The loss of income was yet another worry that Sarah could see in her mother's tired eyes, another burden she had inadvertently placed on her family's shoulders. But Jennifer never complained, her hands always gentle as she helped Sarah wash, change, eat, tasks that had become monumentally difficult. The pain continued to increase, and with it came fear, sharp and immediate. Sarah overheard Dr. Chan talking to her parents about the possibility of preterm labor, about the need for steroids to help the baby's lungs develop faster, about survival rates in intensive care units. Each new medical term added another layer of anxiety to her already overwhelming situation. Nights were the hardest. The house would grow quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the occasional creak of floorboards as someone, usually Jennifer, checked on her. Sarah would lie awake, counting her breaths, counting the baby's movements, counting the hours until dawn. Sometimes she cried, silent tears that seemed to flow from some deep well of fear and uncertainty inside her. But there were moments of grace, too. Madison started visiting after school, bringing homework and gossip, and, most importantly, normalcy. She would sit cross-legged on the bed, careful of the monitors and tubes, and talk about everything and nothing, which boy still had cooties, who sat with whom at lunch, the disaster that was substitute teacher Mr. Peterson's attempt to teach algebra. Jack gave up basketball practice 3 days a week to come home and sit with Sarah, playing video games on a TV he'd moved into her room, letting her win at Mario Kart even though they both knew he was letting her. He'd tell her about school, about the teachers who asked, about her, about how the principal had shut down a reporter who tried to sneak onto campus to get information about her story. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between pain and fear, Sarah found herself talking to her babies. She told them about her life, about the childhood she was leaving behind, about her hopes and fears for their future together. She promised them she would be strong, would protect them, would love them, even though she didn't yet know how to be a mother. The calendar on her wall marked the passing days with doctor's appointments and medication schedules. Each morning brought new challenges, stronger pain, more frequent monitoring, increasing worry in the doctor's faces. But it also brought small victories. Each day the babies grew stronger. Each ultrasound showed progress. Each moment they stayed safely inside was another moment closer to survival. Spring was fading into summer outside her window. Sarah watched the seasons change through the glass, marking time by the changing colors of the maple tree's leaves and the patterns of birds that visited her windowsill. Her body, once familiar and predictable, had become a stranger to her, swollen and heavy, marked by stretch marks that appeared like lightning bolts across her skin. The world beyond her room continued its normal rhythm, but within these walls, time seemed to move differently. Each hour was measured in heartbeats, her own, racing and uncertain, and those of her 11 miracles, each one a testament to the impossible task her young body had undertaken. As night fell once again, Sarah placed her hands on her growing belly, feeling the movement beneath her skin, and whispered a prayer for strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring. That prayer for strength would be answered sooner than Sarah expected. As midnight approached, the familiar movements beneath her skin changed character, becoming sharper, more insistent. The monitor beside her bed registered the change before she could call out, its steady beeping shifting to a more urgent rhythm that brought Jennifer running from her makeshift bed in the corner. "Mom," Sarah whispered, fear making her voice tremble. "Something's different." The words had barely left her lips when a pain unlike anything she'd felt before seized her small body. It wasn't like the usual discomfort she'd grown accustomed to. This was primal, overwhelming, like her body was trying to tear itself apart from the inside. Jennifer's hands were steady as she checked the monitors, but Sarah could see the panic in her eyes. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. The medical equipment that had become so familiar, now seeming inadequate for what was coming. Through the window, a full moon hung low in the Minnesota sky, casting everything in a surreal silvery light. "David!" Jennifer's call brought Sarah's father stumbling into the room, still pulling on a shirt. One look at the monitors, and he was reaching for the phone, dialing Dr. Whitman's emergency number with fingers that shook slightly. Sarah heard fragments of the conversation through waves of pain. Contractions, too early, beginning to dilate. Events began to move with frightening speed. The ambulance arrived with its lights flashing, but sirens silent, casting red and white patterns across the sleeping neighborhood. EMTs filled Sarah's room, their practiced movements and professional calm a stark contrast to the chaos Sarah felt inside. They transferred her to a stretcher with careful precision, each bump and movement sending new waves of pain through her body. The night air was cool on Sarah's face as they wheeled her out, perhaps the last fresh air she would feel for a while. Jack stood in the doorway, still in his basketball shorts and t-shirt, looking younger than his 15 years as he watched his little sister being loaded into the ambulance. "I'll call Madison," he called out. "We'll be right behind you." The ambulance ride was a BL. UR of motion and monitoring equipment. Jennifer held Sarah's hand, speaking soft words of encouragement that barely penetrated the fog of pain and fear. Sarah tried to focus on the passing streetlights, counting them like she used to count stars, but another contraction would steal her concentration before she could reach 10. Minneapolis General Hospital's emergency entrance was already prepared for their arrival. Dr. Whitman stood waiting with a team of specialists, their faces serious beneath surgical masks. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright after the darkness of night, making everything feel stark and overwhelming. "Sarah," Dr. Whitman's voice cut through her pain-induced haze, "you're in early labor. The babies are showing signs of distress, and we need to perform an emergency cesarean section. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak through another contraction. She caught fragments of medical conversation as they rushed her through the corridors. "Prepare, or one. Neonatal team standing by, blood products ready." Each word added to the surreal quality of the moment, making it feel both immediate and distant, like a dream she couldn't wake from. The operating room was a study in organized chaos. Machines beeped and whirred. Medical staff moved with practiced efficiency, and somewhere in the background, Sarah could hear someone counting surgical instruments. The ceiling above her was a grid of bright lights and white tiles, giving her something to focus on as the anesthesiologist explained what would happen next. "You'll feel some pressure," he said, his eyes kind above his mask, "but no pain. We're going to take good care of you and your babies." Jennifer, now dressed in surgical scrubs, maintained her position by Sarah's head, one hand stroking her daughter's hair, while the other held tight to her hand. David had to wait outside. There wasn't enough room for both parents with all the medical personnel needed for such an unusual delivery. The operation began, and Sarah felt the strange sensation of pressure without pain. Dr. Whitman's voice remained steady as he worked, calling out details that Sarah tried to follow but couldn't quite comprehend. The room was filled with medical staff, a team for each baby, she realized, plus those caring for her. "First baby," Dr. Whitman announced, and seconds later, a tiny cry pierced the operating room. Sarah felt tears running down her face as Jennifer pressed a kiss to her forehead. "A girl," someone called out, and then the baby was whisked away to a waiting incubator. The next several minutes passed in a blur of announcements and tiny cries. 2, 3, 4, each baby announced and quickly moved to waiting medical teams. Sarah tried to catch glimpses of them, but could only see small bundles being rushed to different corners of the room. 5, 6, 7. The pressure in her abdomen lessened with each delivery, but her anxiety grew. Would they all survive? Would they be healthy? The beeping of multiple heart monitors created a symphony of life in the operating room. 8, 9, 10. Sarah's vision began to blur, and she heard someone mention blood pressure dropping. Jennifer's hand tightened on hers, and she could hear the fear in her mother's voice as she called her name. "Last one," Dr. Whitman announced, and the 11th cry joined the chorus of tiny voices. But something was wrong. Sarah could feel it in the sudden tension in the room, in the urgent voices of the medical team, in the way Jennifer's hand trembled against her forehead. Blood pressure dropping, transfusion needed, crash cart standing by. The words floated above her like birds, just out of reach. The ceiling tiles began to spin, the lights blurring into starbursts. Sarah tried to focus on the sounds of her babies, 11 new voices in the world, but even they seemed to be fading. "Stay with us, Sarah," Dr. Whitman's voice commanded. "You've done the impossible." "No. You need to stay strong for just a little longer." Sarah felt cold spreading through her veins. New blood, she realized dimly, replacing what she'd lost. The ceiling stopped spinning gradually, the voices around her becoming clearer again. She could hear 11 different crying patterns now, 11 different rhythms of life that she had brought into the world. "She's stabilizing," someone announced, and Sarah felt Jennifer's sob of relief against her hand. The operation continued, closing, cleaning, monitoring. But Sarah's attention was fixed on the corner of the room where she could just see the rows of incubators, each containing a tiny piece of the miracle she'd carried. Hours passed in what felt like minutes. Sarah was moved to recovery, where David was finally allowed to see her. His eyes were red, and his voice cracked as he told her how proud he was, how brave she'd been, how perfect each tiny baby looked. The neonatal intensive care unit became her new world. 11 incubators in a row, each containing a fighter weighing less than 2 pounds. The nurses helped her touch them through the incubator ports, their skin like silk against her fingertips. Each had a different personality already. One squirmed constantly, another slept peacefully, a third gripped her finger with surprising strength. Sarah's own recovery was slow. Her body, pushed far beyond its limits, needed time to heal. But every day she grew stronger, and every day her babies grew too. They were celebrities in the NICU. The 11 miracle babies and their 11-year-old mother, defying every medical expectation. Madison was allowed to visit once Sarah was stronger, and she brought a stuffed animal for each baby. "They need names," she declared, setting up the small zoo around Sarah's hospital room. "Real ones, not just baby A through baby K. The naming became a family project. Jennifer brought baby name books, and they spent hours discussing possibilities. Each baby needed a name that would carry the weight of their extraordinary beginning while giving them the freedom to become their own person. As summer bloomed outside the hospital windows, Sarah watched her children grow stronger day by day. The impossible had happened, and yet here they were, 11 tiny lives that had begun inside her, 11 futures waiting to unfold. And as she drifted off to sleep in her hospital room, lulled by the gentle beeping of monitors and the soft sounds of her baby's breathing, Sarah realized that her prayer for strength had been answered in ways she never could have imagined. Through the window, the same moon that had witnessed their dramatic arrival into the world now watched over their first quiet nights. Sarah's hand rested on her empty belly, still marked by their presence, while her heart expanded to hold more love than she had ever thought possible. In the NICU next door, 11 tiny hearts beat in their own unique rhythms, a symphony of survival and hope that would forever change the meaning of the word family. The symphony of 11 heartbeats became the soundtrack of Sarah's new life. Each morning began before dawn, when the night shift nurses would help her make her careful way to the NICU, her own body still healing as she learned to be a mother 11 times over. The sterile hospital corridors that had once seemed so frightening now felt like familiar paths to her most precious treasures. Names had finally been chosen for each tiny fighter. Emma, the firstborn who gripped fingers with surprising strength. Lily, whose dark eyes seemed wise beyond her minutes. Sophie, the constant wiggler. Grace, peaceful even during procedures. Olivia, who cried only when her siblings did. Hannah, whose tiny fingers already reached for her brothers and sisters. Ava, the smallest but fiercest Mia, who calmed instantly at Sarah's touch. Isabella, whose smile appeared earliest. Zoe, who watched everything with quiet intensity. And Charlotte, the last-born, who fought hardest for every breath. The NICU became a second home, not just for Sarah but for the entire Thompson family. Jennifer practically lived there, learning alongside her daughter how to care for babies so tiny they could fit in the palm of her hand. David split his time between the hospital and work, often appearing during his lunch break, still wearing his construction site hard hat, careful to follow the strict sanitization procedures before approaching his granddaughters. Jack discovered a gentleness nobody had expected from a teenage basketball player. He would sit for hours, reading to his nieces from his school books, his deep voice carrying through the NICU until even the nurses would stop to listen. They need to learn physics early, he joked, but Sarah caught him more than once reading them Goodnight Moon when he thought nobody was watching. The medical challenges were constant. Each baby faced different hurdles. Emma's lungs needed extra support. Lily struggled with feeding. Sophie's heart required careful monitoring. Sarah learned medical terminology that no 11-year-old should need to know, could read oxygen saturation levels, and understand blood gas results with the expertise of a seasoned nurse. Dr. Whitman made daily rounds, his face showing both professional pride and personal investment in their progress. "They're fighters," he would say, reviewing charts and adjusting treatments. Just like their mother. The words always made Sarah's heart swell, even as it ached with the weight of responsibility. The media circus outside the hospital grew as word spread of the miraculous delivery. Reporters camped out in the parking lot, hoping for a glimpse of the family or a quote from the medical team. The hospital assigned security to the NICU floor, carefully screening visitors to protect the privacy of their youngest patients and their young mother. Sarah's grandmother moved permanently into the Thompson house, turning the kitchen into a command center for managing the practical aspects of life with 11 newborns. Lists covered every surface: supplies needed, feeding schedules, medication times. The guest room became a storage facility for diapers and formula, donations arriving daily from community members touched by their story. Madison visited after school, bringing homework and normalcy along with handmade cards for each baby. She'd sit with Sarah during feeding times, helping to hold bottles and singing softly to the babies who were awake. "You're going to need a bigger best friend necklace," she joked one day, fingering the half-heart pendant she'd worn since 4th grade. "One that splits 12 ways." The nurses became extended family, each taking special interest in different babies. Nurse Maria had a way with Sophie that could calm her worst fussing. Nurse James seemed to know instinctively when Charlotte needed suctioning before her monitors even showed distress. Nurse Diane taught Sarah how to change diapers smaller than her palm, her experienced hands guiding Sarah's uncertain ones. Milestone moments came in waves. First time holding each baby skin to skin, first successful bottle feeding, first day without breathing support. Sarah celebrated each victory, no matter how small, marking them in a journal Jennifer had bought her. Someday, her mother said, they'll want to know every detail of their story. The days fell into a rhythm. Sarah would arrive early, helping with morning care before starting her tutoring sessions in a small conference room nearby. Her teachers had been understanding, creating a modified curriculum that allowed her to continue her education while being present for her daughters. Between lessons, she would return to the NICU, learning to juggle textbooks and feeding schedules, math problems and diaper changes. Nights were the hardest, leaving her babies in the capable hands of the night shift nurses. Sarah would lie in her own bed, her body still adjusting to its new normal, and watch the videos Jennifer had taken during the day. 11 tiny faces, 11 different expressions, 11 miracles that somehow all began with her. The seasons changed outside the hospital windows, summer heat giving way to autumn crispness. The maple trees on the hospital grounds turned brilliant shades of red and gold, visible from the NICU windows where Sarah spent her days watching her daughters grow stronger. Each baby developed their own personality. Emma, always alert during story time. Lily, who loved music. Sophie, reaching for her sister's hands through the incubator walls. Progress came in tiny increments. Weights increased gram by gram. Feeding volumes grew milliliter by milliliter. The babies were moved from incubators to open cribs one by one, each transition a celebration. The wall of monitors that had once seemed overwhelming became a familiar comfort, their steady beeping a lullaby that meant her children were fighting, growing, thriving. Sarah's own body healed slowly, the physical trauma of carrying and delivering 11 babies leaving its mark. But each scar became a badge of honor. Each stretch mark a reminder of the miracle she had somehow accomplished. The child in her was fading, replaced by something else. Not quite an adult, but a mother nonetheless, with all the fierce love and protective instinct that role demanded. The hospital social worker helped them prepare for the eventual homecoming, though that still seemed like a distant dream. The Thompson house underwent renovations. The basement transformed into a state-of-the-art nursery with monitoring equipment that matched the NICU's. Jennifer took courses in infant CPR and emergency response, then taught the skills to the entire family, including Jack's basketball team, who had volunteered to help with baby care. Community support continued to pour in. The local church organized a meal train that would last months. Neighbors formed volunteer schedules to help with household tasks. Sarah's classmates made blankets in home economics class, one for each baby, embroidered with their names and birthdays. As fall deepened, the babies began reaching the 2-pound mark, then 3. Their faces filled out, showing family resemblances that sparked endless discussion. Emma had Sarah's green eyes, while Lily's smile was pure Jennifer. Sophie's determined expression matched Jack's game face, and Grace had David's calm demeanor. Each evening, before leaving the NICU, Sarah would touch each tiny hand, count each rising chest, whisper each carefully chosen name. The nurses would smile, understanding this ritual of motherhood, this need to ensure every child felt equally loved, equally special. And each night, as she fell asleep to the memory of 11 different heartbeats, Sarah would marvel at how life could change so completely, so irrevocably, and yet feel somehow exactly as it should be. The moon that had witnessed their birth continued its cycles, watching over 11 tiny girls who grew stronger every day, and one young mother who grew with them, learning lessons in love and strength that most people never have to learn. In the quiet of the NICU, under the soft glow of monitoring equipment, a new kind of family was forming, one that defied medical science, exceeded expectations, and rewrote the rules of what was possible when love and determination combined. The first homecoming was almost anticlimactic in its quietness. Emma, the firstborn and strongest, was deemed ready to leave the NICU on a crisp October morning. Sarah sat in the back seat of her parents' newly purchased van. The first of two, they need to transport the whole family, holding her daughter's car seat with trembling hands. The tiny girl, now a robust 5 pounds, slept peacefully, unaware she was making history as the first of the 11 to leave the hospital's protective cocoon. "One down, 10 to go," Jack whispered from the seat beside her, his varsity tie jacket draped carefully over Emma's car seat to shield her from the autumn wind. The drive home felt surreal, each traffic light and turn bringing them further from the security of the NICU and closer to the reality of caring for a newborn at home while still having 10 babies in the hospital. The Thompson house had transformed during the months of NICU stays. The basement nursery, once just plans and possibilities, now hummed with the familiar beeping of monitors. A nursing station had been set up in one corner, staffed by a rotating team of home health nurses who would help care for the babies as they came home one by one. The walls, painted in soft yellows and greens, were covered with pictures of all 11 girls, ensuring that each sister's presence would be felt even before they could all be together. Emma's first night home established a pattern that would repeat 10 more times over the coming weeks. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, couldn't sleep, watching the rise and fall of her daughter's chest in the bassinet beside her bed. Jennifer took the first shift, then David, then Jack, the family moving in a carefully choreographed dance of feedings, diaper changes, and monitoring vital signs. Lily followed Emma home a week later, then Sophie 3 days after that. Each homecoming brought new challenges and adjustments. The house began to fill with the sounds of babies, not just crying, but the soft coos and sighs that Sarah had come to recognize as uniquely belonging to each of her daughters. The quiet efficiency of the NICU was replaced by a more chaotic, but somehow more natural rhythm of family life. Grace and Olivia came home together, a surprise decision by Dr. Whitman that sent the household into a happy scramble to prepare for 2 at once. The twins, though not technically twins at all, had grown used to being next to each other in the NICU and seemed calmer when kept together. Sarah spent hours watching them sleep, their tiny hands often finding each other across the space between their bassinets. Madison had become an honorary member of the household, coming straight from school to help with afternoon feedings. She developed a special bond with Hannah, the 6th to come home, who would calm immediately at the sound of Madison's voice singing Disney songs. "She's got good taste," Madison would say, rocking Hannah while helping Sarah with her algebra homework. The media attention, which had never fully died down, surged again with each homecoming. Reporters tried to catch glimpses of the babies through windows, offered increasingly large sums for exclusive photos and interviews. Jennifer handled them with firm politeness, while David installed better security systems and privacy fencing around their property. Sarah's grandmother coordinated an army of volunteers from their church and community. Meals appeared like clockwork. Laundry was mysteriously done and folded. The lawn stayed mowed despite no one in the family having time for yard work. It was a testament to the power of community, of strangers coming together to support a miracle they all felt somehow part of. By Thanksgiving, only Charlotte, Zoe, and Isabella remained in the NICU. The holiday was celebrated in shifts, with family members rotating between home and hospital so neither group of babies would be without family on the special day. Sarah insisted on having dinner with her 3 daughters still in the hospital, and the NICU staff set up a small celebration in the family room, complete with turkey brought from home and pumpkin pie made by one of the nurses. The learning curve was steep. Sarah mastered the art of bottle feeding 2 babies at once, learned to distinguish between hungry cries and tired cries, memorized medication schedules and feeding preferences for each daughter. Her own schoolwork continued, though modified to accommodate her new responsibilities. Her teachers marveled at her ability to complete assignments while caring for her growing family, her determination to succeed academically matching her dedication to motherhood. Winter arrived with swirling snowflakes and the promise of more homecomings. Zoe and Isabella were released just before Christmas, leaving only Charlotte, the smallest and most fragile, still requiring NICU care. The holiday season brought both joy and longing. Joy for the 8 babies cooing and growing at home. Longing for the day when all 11 would be together under one roof. The Thompson house became a symphony of baby sounds, monitor beeps, and the constant hum of activity. Sarah learned to sleep in short bursts, her body adapting to the demands of caring for multiple newborns. Her own childhood seemed like a distant memory, though she was still very much a child herself in many ways. She still kept her stuffed animals on her bed, still loved watching cartoons with Jack on Saturday mornings, still needed her mother's hugs when things became overwhelming. Charlotte's homecoming, when it finally happened in late January, was celebrated like a holiday. The house was decorated with welcome signs, and all 10 of her sisters seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying uncharacteristically quiet as their final sibling was carried through the door. Sarah held her youngest daughter close, breathing in the sweet baby scent that she had come to know so well, marveling at how complete her world finally felt. That first night with all 11 babies under one roof was both terrifying and wonderful. The basement nursery was fully staffed with nurses, but Sarah insisted on staying there too, wanting to witness every moment of this new chapter. She moved between bassinets, touching each small hand, counting fingers and toes that had grown so much from their first days, whispering names and promises to each sleeping face. As the winter moon rose outside, casting silver light through the nursery windows, Sarah sat in the rocking chair that had become her command center. Around her, 11 babies slept peacefully, their combined breathing creating a gentle rhythm that seemed to match her own heartbeat. The monitors beeped softly, the nurses moved quietly between bassinets, and Sarah felt, for the first time since this journey began, completely at peace. In this moment, surrounded by the miracle she had somehow created, Sarah realized that her life had found its purpose in the most unexpected way. She was still growing up herself, still learning and changing, but now she had 11 tiny teachers showing her the way. Each smile, each milestone, each small victory was a reminder that the impossible was possible, that love could multiply without dividing, that family could be redefined in the most extraordinary ways. The night deepened, and Sarah continued her vigil, watching over her sleeping daughters with a maturity that belied her years. Outside, the Minnesota winter wrapped the house in a blanket of snow, insulating their private world of miracles and mundane moments, of challenges and triumphs, of a love so big it had to be shared 11 ways to be contained.